Welcome back for our last painting tutorial in this little Christmas themed series. Thank you so much if you've been joining us every week with the tutorials. I'm so grateful for all of you who are painting along or just watching and getting some inspiration and leaving comments. I thank you. So let's get started, shall we? All right, let's get started with a simple sphere. You could sketch this out or you could trace something. I apologize, I started sketching it before I realized, you know what, I'll just record it in case it turns out. But you can see I am not really being precious with it. I drew a circle and then I chucked some sort of pizza slice shapes into it, leaving a bit of a center to the orange. Then a simple circle with an offset circle inside of it. We are making a mug. But these are really quick sketches. And then a little handle off to the side is just a rectangle with a little curved line off to the side to show the handle, a tiny sliver of the bottom of the handle. These are marshmallows, if you can't tell, i.e. blobs. Draw some blobs in there. How about 5? Do 3, 5, 7, do an odd number of little marshmallow blobs. I'm using my Prismacolor Col-Erase, so that's why I'm able to erase the colored pencil. I highly recommend using colored pencil for these just because we're letting them be super sketchy. It's just the style I've gone with. So if this was pencil, you'd have a lot of gray liner everywhere, which is fine, but I am really loving the look of colored line through and underneath and part of the watercolor. So I did a candy cane shape and I'm just doing diagonal stripes all the way down. Next, for the cinnamon sticks, I'm doing a long line, so kind of a cylinder with a curved end there. Little, not a circle, but like a little oval at the end and a curved line at the other end. And I'm kind of making it, it almost looks like an 8, but more like a B. So the center circles aren't really connected. We want it to look like it's curled up on itself, almost like a scroll shape. So there's 2 lines down the center on purpose. And then I'm doing a little one offset underneath it. Same thing, we want the edges to be curved, and in the center, the roll of the cinnamon is not connected. For the candle, which again is drawn from above, we're going to do a circle and a slightly smaller circle to show the candle inside of the glass holder. And then at the very center, there's an even smaller circle where the little pool of wax is melted, a little tiny wick, and a flame shape. For the little sprig of a pine tree, I am going to do 3 main lines. The center one's the longest, and a whole bunch of scribbles off of that one. And they're just like little V shapes. The V's are angling towards the center. Yeah, you can see, rough and quick. Don't be precious with it. The roughness of this sketch is part of the charm of this week's little tutorial. Here's a very loose, swirly ribbon. That one's a little trickier to draw, but I offset it. So just pause the video and take a look at how I made the ribbon sort of twist. I drew the first line and then the line that goes beside it. Every time I kind of got to a corner, I switched which side that second line was on, and that sort of makes the ribbon look like it's twisted. I'm using a red Col-Erase pencil here to make the stripes darker and add thinner stripes between the big ones. The overall drawing sketch so far was done in an orange Col-Erase. I'm still holding the red here for the berries. I am kind of coloring them in too a little bit. And I'm leaving a little bit of white on each of the berries, a little highlight to show they're round and they're getting some light. I would do, the first clump I did was 3. That's just a very pleasing number to look at. I'm trying to do an odd sort of an arrangement to make it look more natural. We don't want it to be too uniform. Things in nature are not uniform. Then I just jump back for a second and make this ribbon a little longer. The composition I was building as I went, so there are some awkward elements to the composition, but I did like the ribbon coming a little further down beside the candle. And what that does is just draws your eye down to the bottom part of the composition. Next, I decide to randomly squish a gingerbread man into this drawing. And I apologize for not zooming out enough, but you all know what gingerbread are shaped like. I've got a little round head, and I just kind of smoothed some arms and legs onto this. These can look weird. I mean, cookie cutters are all different shapes and styles, so Google if you want to be more particular than what I'm doing. That actually goes for anything we're drawing. Feel free to Google and use images as your references if that will make you more comfortable, and you can achieve a little bit more realism that way. I'm gonna add 2 little eyes and a smile because he has to be happy. Gotta have buttons. And then I do squiggly sort of like icing lines on his arms and legs because we fancy. Then I just sort of reinforce the outer edge and kind of sharpen up the mug a little bit. It was getting kind of smeared by my hand from the other drawings. Didn't realize how smudgy these were. I grab a blue, the dark blue, and add some shadows this way and outline a bit of this mug. It just needed crisping up, but blue's a great shadow color. So I'm going to add it to the bottom side of all of these little sketches. Do you see how rough I'm being? It does not need to be precise. The red here is adding shadow to the actual objects themselves on the left-hand side of both the cane and a little bit on the handle of the mug. We're going to use a little bit of shadow inside the candle here. And then the blue is going to be the shadow that it's casting, the cast shadow onto the table. Very light, very scribbly, adds to part of its charm. Even our buttons have shadows. So I go ahead and I add a little bit of blue shadow, kind of one-sided, beside the tree sprig, on the inside of one side of the orange, outside of the other, to the left and bottom of most of our sketches. Inside of the cinnamon. And then the red is the shadow on the actual roll of the cinnamon stick. Our marshmallows need a bit of shadowing to make them stand out and not look so flat. And then really just going at it with the scribbles for the tree part. I think we're ready to paint. Shall we paint? Let's go paint. So I'm using a round size 8 brush. I'm going to clean my palette just a little bit before we get going here because we need to mix a nice orange. I'm going to use cadmium yellow with transparent pyrrole orange, which is a very strong color, that pyrrole orange. You just need a tiny bit of it and it goes a long way. If you do not like what you're doing, just lift it up with a paper towel. I do this all the time. And the reason is I didn't quite leave enough white between the sections. I want to leave the sections between the orange bits at least a pale yellow, if not white. So that was a little mistake for me, just from me just rushing in. This whole process was just kind of slapdash, just meant to be really fun. I had no idea it would turn out as nicely as it did, but it was fun to make, and so that's got to count for something. When I lifted it the second time, I think I got a little bit more paint off of it, and it was a bit more white. I'm going to do the very, very edge, the rind, a little bit more orange than the center. So I'm using the tip of the brush. If you use the tip of round brushes, you can get quite a lot of detail. Then I drop some dark orange into the sections, but not all of them. You see, I just drop it into like a little bit of the triangle and let it bleed in, just for some more interest. And it's off camera, but you can see anytime I reach up to the top, that's me getting water or cleaning my brush. I mixed quite a light brown for the cinnamon sticks. And that's ultramarine brown that I'm adding for the shadow. And then a burnt umber for that kind of reddish brown, that really strong red brown. And just in case you're curious, the brown next to that, the one that's farthest right before the pink color, is raw sienna. So a bit of burnt umber and a bit of ultramarine blue makes a chocolatey dark brown for our hot chocolate. For this one, I do make sure to avoid the marshmallow shapes. They're not real good marshmallow shapes. They're kind of blobs, but I'm imagining that they're just a bit melty. And mixing a bit more blue and gray in for the shadowed side. Note that the shadow of the hot chocolate would be up near the top where the cup is casting a bit of a shadow. And I drop a little bit of darkness behind each of the marshmallows because they too would cast a little bit of a shadow. This is quinacridone rose. And I'm going to make my mug red. It's a pinky kind of red. And I'm dragging it not over the whole mug. I'm dragging it along the bottom side, and I'm leaving kind of a highlight on the top edge of both sides of the mug, the rim of the mug. I'm dropping some shadow violet onto my marshmallows. It came on a little strong, so lightening that up a bit and making it a bit more blue-gray. I didn't want the marshmallows to look red. By adding the bit of the pyrrole orange, you can see it just changes that pink to be more of a red. I'm going to paint over the lines that I drew in. You don't have to do this, but you can see it's much brighter, so it kind of packs a punch. And it's almost a tiny bit purpley, but I try to lift that darkness off a little bit. I I'm aiming for a kind of, not maroon red, but cranberry red, deep red. If you find it difficult to get detail with your size 8 brush, maybe size down for that. But since I'm drawing this, since this thing is like way bigger than a greeting card size, it's my sketchbook, it's closer to 7 by 10. The tip of the size 8 brush is just fine for me, but a 4 might be good if you're a little less experienced or you want more control. I mixed phthalo green with some sap green and did the exact same very sketchy marks from the center out to get my shaggy tree. It goes over the berry just a little bit in places, that would be fine. I really enjoy the red sketchy marks through the green. I think I'll try this style more later. What I did here is I totally altered the drawing, right? I sketched the third little tree sprig lower than I initially had it, and that's to fill a little bit of the space lower right that is left on this page. I could have added something else down there, like some bells or some other little small Christmas themed thing, but I kind of felt happy with the number of stuff I already had drawn out. So just mixing a bit of phthalo green with sap green here and making one side just a little bit darker as if there's more shadow hitting that side. And it's not covering up the whole area, so it's kind of making stripes. It's not covering up the sap green entirely. I'm using the very tip, so I'm holding the size 8 brush almost vertical to get that fine mark. I'm going to make the ribbon green as well, and that just spreads the color out throughout the drawing a little bit more and creates some more balance, because green is quite a strong color and so far it's the only green thing on the page. So just adding this one other detail in green will, I think, help balance it. I just mixed a slightly darker green with the phthalo green, and that is Perylene green, and it's very, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's very, very dark. It looks almost black. And I love mixing that into my other greens to deepen them. I'm making the shadow on the candle wax itself be kind of a pale green, gray, sorry. So imagining that the candle wax is white. The little melted part has a shadow as well. And then a little bit of cadmium yellow for the flame. You can see the gray kind of bled into it a little bit. I'm gonna mix some raw umber, and I tested out here a little bit. There was a hair stuck on my brush. And I don't quite like the color of the brown for the gingerbread. Usually they are a little bit redder, red brown. So that's what I'm mixing right now is burnt umber with some burnt sienna to get a reddish, rusty brown. And I'm going to paint around the squiggles. I want to leave the squiggles white as if they're icing. I'm going to paint around the buttons. And I'm just going to fast forward this part because it's very straightforward. It's fun. It's like a coloring book. It's important to work while it's wet so that the paint can bleed into itself and it won't make quite so many streaks. If your work is very streaky and you're working wet and you're keeping it wet and it's still very streaky, it's probably a problem with paper. You're probably going to need to get something a little that absorbs a little differently, something specifically for watercolor, or maybe even a higher quality watercolor. I mixed dark brown for the shadow. I am trying to shade a bit of the side of the cookie to make it look like it's slightly less flat. It's got a little tiny bit of an edge. And after I shade the edge of the cookie, I put shadow beside all of the buttons and icing to make it look like it too is sticking up off of the gingerbread man. I'm going to mix a bit of a darker color here so that I can add some shading to other elements. So I'm going to add one side of this candy cane is going to be a bit darker. I highly recommend waiting for that candy cane to dry fully before you paint a shadow over it. Otherwise, you're just going to make a big mess. So let things dry in between adding the shadow on top. I'm going to drop some nice bright red in on top of these berries. So they didn't need to be colored in with the colored pencil, but what that did was it helped us remember to leave highlights on each one. So it was helpful, but not necessarily crucial to do that step. This part is super satisfying. Next, I'm going to brighten up this whole mug. It's quite dull, quite faded. And so I'm adding this nice bright red I mixed, but I'm going to make sure to maintain the highlights. Notice that when I'm painting the rim of the cup here, I am not painting it all in. I'm painting I almost said southern, the bottom side, the southern side of the rim, and leaving a highlight around the whole top of the mug. Now that mug really pops up and appears more three-dimensional. So you see the theme here. I'm now mixing sort of deeper versions of all the color and going back through. It's dry already, so I can add selective alterations to the value. I can make it darker in places or more rich if it dried too pale or too dull. That's very, very common. It's not like we did anything wrong. Watercolor does dry more pale than when you first put it on, so it does require several layers. The more experienced you get, obviously, the less likely you're going to be going back and back and back and adding more and more paint. We also don't want to mess with the paper too much, especially if it's not meant for watercolor. The book I'm working in is like a mixed media, so the paper is pretty durable, but you don't want to do more than, I don't know, I don't want to put a number to it, but probably 3 or 4 passes over adding darkness and or different colors, glazes. I feel like 4 layers should be enough to accomplish what we're wanting to do. More experienced, traditionally taught watercolorists might have something different to say. They might say, no, you need countless layers, 10 layers. I don't know. I taught myself watercolor, so bear that in mind. I'm making the dark orange kind of streaky. I'm not covering the entirety of the sections. I'm just dragging it in streaks from the center out towards the rind. Now I'm taking a dark orange and I am outlining the outside of the circle. Next, I painted the candle holder orange, trying to tie the orange into the composition, and changed my mind and just dumped some green on top of it, made it kind of bright and rich right from the start. I mean, it had to go over top of an orange. And then I mix a nice gray and lay in some shadow from the cinnamon sticks onto the table. I have to be kind of careful there because it was sort of touching the mug. I also put a tiny bit of a shadow on top of that second cinnamon stick, showing that the one on top is actually casting a shadow onto the cinnamon stick. And then I just go ahead and add this shadow throughout. You can see the red there bleeding into the shadow. If you don't want that, you need to keep, a little tiny sliver of white space between the two, or just wait for it to dry. This whole thing was done rather rapidly and rather impatiently, so I don't mind that effect of things running. It just emphasizes that we are working with watercolor, this joyous and slightly random medium. Next, I take a little mini break to erase the initial red of this tree sprig and then continue along on my journey of making shadow. Now watch when I do the shadow of the ribbon. So the gray shadow is touching the very edge of that ribbon until I get to this spot right here, where I leave a white section between the shadow and the ribbon while it curves there, and that's to show the ribbon coming off of the table. So it's casting a shadow that's not directly touching it, and that's something that's such a small little detail. It's not super important, but it kind of has a really realistic effect whenever you're dealing with something a bit more organic that might not be touching the table in all spots. You could do that with your shadow. Now I'm adding a bit of shadow to the tree. I don't know what to call it, sprig, branch. And around the berry. And it's just kind of going over top of the blue shadow that we sketched in, and the blue shows through and kind of gives the style a little bit more interest, I think. After adding a bit more shadow to the other items on the page, I mixed a deep brown to cut in some detail for those cinnamon sticks and a little bit of the mug. And I find it really effective. It's a brown gray. And just adding a touch of this dark value brings some more dimension to the whole thing. Yeah, I definitely shouldn't put a number to the amount of layers you can add to a watercolor piece. It's up to you. So a whole lot more of that, enhancing shadows, erasing a couple of fuzzy edges to the drawing around the cookie there, and mixing a deep green to bring some more dimension to this tree bough. At this point, it's just whatever you feel your piece needs. You might have to depart from what you're watching me do and just really focus on your own painting and what it might need. I lifted a bit of that bleeding red off of the page there. It's the glory of a dry brush. You can swipe a dry brush or a drier brush over top of paint and it will scoop it up. Magical. So So here we are, the finished effect. It's sketchy, it's imperfect, it's wild, but it's also beautiful. And it was so, so much fun to create. And we're done. This brings my little watercolor Christmas theme tutorial series to a close. Thank you for coming along and painting and sharing and commenting. I so appreciate it. I am so excited about the new year and all the art we will make in 2023. What is on the top of your list of creations this year? What's on your bucket list of making? For me, I have a solo art show coming up in April, and so I will be working steadily on some acrylic and oil paintings for that show. This is one of them. I plan on just knocking the sketchbook work out of the park and really giving it a full go on urban sketching and sort of art journaling. Watercolor and ink has always been just a go-to for me. I discovered it in my early 20s, so it's a common thread through all the years of something that I can pick up when I don't have much time. So I'm really thrilled that I'm back into a steady habit with that. So let me know, what does 2023 look like for you and your creative endeavors? I'm super curious. And see you in the new year. Goodbye, 2022. Why do I do this wave?